Silent Night. Chapter 1. The Shattered Peace. Snow fell gently on the quaint town of Pine Hollow, dusting the roofs of the cottages and clinging to the branches of the towering evergreens. Christmas lights flickered like tiny beacons of hope, casting warm glows across the icy streets. The town square, centered around a grand fir tree, was abuzz with last-minute holiday shoppers, their voices mingling with the sound of carolers and the distant pealing of church bells. But beneath the festive cheer, a cold undercurrent of unease seeped through the town, unnoticed by the joyous crowds. It was a feeling that had settled in the bones of the town's older residents, those who had lived through its darkest days and knew that Pine Hollow had its secrets. A darkness that had been buried for years was beginning to stir, its presence marked by a series of small, strange occurrences. The sudden disappearance of household pets, the unsettling screams heard at odd hours of the night, and now, on Christmas Eve, a thick fog that rolled into town, obscuring the path ahead. Sheriff Tom Harlan stood at the edge of the town square, his eyes scanning the happy faces before him. Yet something felt wrong, terribly wrong. The festive lights seemed to flicker ominously, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. The fog curled around his feet like a living thing, wrapping the town in an eerie silence. He tried to shake off the unease that gnawed at him, but a shiver ran down his spine as his eyes caught sight of a figure lurking in the distance. It was a man draped in a long dark coat, standing motionless near the edge of the square, half hidden by the mist. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but Sheriff Harlan could feel the stranger's gaze fixed upon him, cold and unblinking. The sheriff took a step forward, intending to approach the man, but before he could, the stranger turned and disappeared into the fog, vanishing as suddenly as he had appeared. His hand instinctively moved to his side, resting on the grip of his revolver. The sense of dread that had been slowly building within him now settled like a heavy weight in his chest. Something was coming, something terrible. He had seen enough in his years as sheriff to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being was telling him that this Christmas Eve would be anything but silent. The bells from the church tower rang out again, signaling midnight. Christmas Day had arrived. But as the final toll echoed through the empty streets, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, cutting through the fog like a knife. The festive chatter came to an abrupt halt, and the square fell into a deafening silence. Sheriff Harlan's heart raced as he ran toward the source of the scream, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. When he reached the alleyway where the sound had come from, he was greeted by a scene of horror. The body of a young woman lay crumpled against the wall, her eyes wide open in a stare of sheer terror. Blood pooled beneath her, staining the pristine snow. The sheriff knelt beside her, checking for any sign of life, but it was too late. She was gone. As the townsfolk began to gather around, murmuring in shock and fear, Sheriff Harlan stood up, his face set in a grim expression. He knew this was just the beginning. Pine Hollow's past had come back to haunt it, and he had no idea how to stop it. Chapter 2. The Hidden Truth. The morning after the murder, Pine Hollow was a town transformed. The festive decorations seemed out of place, grotesque against the backdrop of horror that had unfolded. Gossip spread like wildfire as fear took root in the hearts of the townspeople. Parents kept their children indoors, shopkeepers closed early, and the once lively square was now eerily quiet. The fog that had rolled in on Christmas Eve lingered, thickening with each passing hour, as if the town itself was shrouded in secrecy. Sheriff Harlan had spent the night gathering what little evidence he could find at the crime scene, but the fog had made it nearly impossible to track down any clues. The alleyway had been scoured, the surrounding streets searched, but the killer had vanished without a trace. The only lead he had was the memory of the mysterious figure he had seen in the square, a man who had seemed to melt into the night. As the sheriff sat in his office, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders, the door creaked open. It was Father O'Connor, the town's priest, his face pale and drawn. He looked as though he hadn't slept, his eyes sunken with worry. "Tom," the priest began, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you, something that may be connected to what happened last night." Sheriff Harlan gestured for him to sit, his curiosity piqued. Father O'Connor was a man of few words, and it was unlike him to be so visibly shaken. "Years ago," the priest continued, lowering his voice as if afraid of being overheard, "before you were sheriff, this town was plagued by a series of crimes that were never solved. Women were found dead, their bodies mutilated in ways too gruesome to describe. It all started around this time of year, and each time the killer seemed to vanish into thin air. We called him the Silent Night Stalker, because his murders always happened on Christmas Eve. The sheriff leaned forward, his pulse quickening. He had heard whispers of the Silent Night Stalker, but the case had been closed long before he took up the badge, the details buried in old files and fading memories. "Why wasn't I told about this before?" he demanded. "Because the killings stopped," Father O'Connor replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The last murder was 20 years ago on Christmas Eve. After that, the town believed the stalker had either died or left, and we hoped it was all behind us. But now," Harlan pressed. "But now," the priest said grimly, "I fear he has returned. Or perhaps someone else has taken up his mantle. Either way, the town is in grave danger, and you must find him before more blood is spilled." Sheriff Harlan's mind raced as he processed the information. If the Silent Night Stalker was truly back, then Pine Hollow was facing a terror it had thought long buried. The implications were chilling. Was it the same man returned after all these years? Or was there a copycat inspired by the horrors of the past? Either way, the clock was ticking, and with each passing moment, the town's Christmas spirit faded further into fear and suspicion. Before Father O'Connor could say more, the phone on the sheriff's desk rang sharply, cutting through the tense silence. Harlan answered it quickly, his heart sinking as he listened to the voice on the other end. Another body had been found. A second murder in less than 24 hours, and on Christmas Day no less. The terror that had gripped Pine Hollow decades ago was back, more vicious and relentless than ever. Sheriff Harlan knew he had to act fast, but the fog that hung over the town seemed to grow thicker by the minute, obscuring not only the streets but also the truth he desperately needed to uncover. As he grabbed his coat and prepared to head out, a cold determination settled in his gut. He would find the killer no matter what it took. But as he stepped out into the swirling mist, a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 3. The dark past. The sun barely pierced the thick layer of fog that clung to Pine Hollow as Sheriff Harlan arrived at the scene of the second murder. The location was another alley not far from the first, and the victim was a young man this time. Like the woman before him, his face was twisted in terror, his life violently snuffed out. The blood pooling around his body was a stark contrast against the white snow, a grotesque reminder that evil was stalking the town. As the sheriff knelt beside the body, his breath visible in the cold air, he felt the weight of the town's history pressing down on him. The Silent Night Stalker was not just a story to scare children, it was a real, living nightmare, and it was happening again. Harlan's hands trembled slightly as he examined the scene, searching for anything that might point him in the right direction. But like before, the killer had left no trace, no clue as to his identity or motives. The streets around the crime scene were deserted, the townspeople too frightened to leave their homes. Only the sound of distant carolers, their voices trembling with fear rather than joy, broke the eerie silence. Harlan's thoughts drifted back to the conversation with Father O'Connor. He had mentioned a series of crimes from 20 years ago, but the details were vague. He needed more information if he was going to stop this killer. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Harlan made his way to the town's archives, a dusty room in the basement of the courthouse. The archives held records dating back to the founding of Pine Hollow, including old newspapers, police reports, and town council minutes. If there was anything to be found about the original Silent Night Stalker, it would be here. As he sifted through the yellowed pages, the hours slipped by, the fog outside thickening as nightfall approached. He read through old headlines: Silent Night Stalker strikes again, Christmas terror grips Pine Hollow, and no leads in brutal Christmas Eve slayings. Each article painted a grim picture of a town terrorized by a faceless killer, a predator who hunted in the shadows and struck without warning. The police reports were equally grim. The original sheriff, a man named Elias Barnes, had led the investigation with a tenacity that rivaled Harlan's own. But despite his best efforts, the stalker had evaded capture, leaving behind only a trail of death and despair. The reports mentioned several suspects, but no one was ever charged. The killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and the case went cold. But as Harlan delved deeper into the files, he found something that made his blood run cold. A list of names, the victims of the Silent Night Stalker. As he read through them, a horrifying pattern emerged. Each of the victims had a connection to a single event, a tragic accident that had occurred nearly 30 years ago, long before the first murder. A fire at the old Pine Hollow Orphanage, which had claimed the lives of several children and left the town reeling. The surviving children had been scattered, placed in foster homes throughout the region. But it seemed that the stalker had been targeting them one by one, seeking some twisted form of vengeance. And now, after all these years, the killer had returned to finish what he had started. Sheriff Harlan felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications. The murders weren't random. They were calculated, part of a decades-long vendetta. The victims were being hunted for something that had happened long ago, and the killer was intent on making Pine Hollow pay for its past sins. As he closed the file, the weight of his discovery settled heavily on his shoulders. He had finally uncovered the dark truth that had been buried for so long, but he knew that finding the killer would be far more difficult. The stalker had eluded capture for decades, and now he was back, more dangerous than ever. Harlan's only hope was to get ahead of the killer, to predict his next move before another life was lost. But as he prepared to leave the archives, a sudden thought struck him. If the murders were connected to the orphanage fire, then there might be someone still alive who could help him. Someone who had survived the fire and might hold the key to the killer's identity. With renewed determination, Sheriff Harlan headed to the one place in town where secrets were kept hidden in plain sight, the local nursing home. If there was anyone left who remembered the orphanage and the fire, it would be the elderly residents there, people who had seen Pine Hollow's history unfold with their own eyes. The clock was ticking, and the fog outside seemed to thicken with each passing minute, as if the town itself was conspiring to keep its secrets hidden. But Harlan was determined to break through the darkness and find the truth, no matter what it cost him. Chapter 4. The Survivor. The Pine Hollow nursing home was a quiet place, nestled at the edge of town where the fog seemed to linger the longest. The building was old, its walls lined with memories of a time long past. As Sheriff Harlan stepped inside, he was greeted by the familiar scent of antiseptic and the low hum of soft Christmas music playing from a crackling radio in the corner. The residents, many of whom had lived in Pine Hollow for decades, sat in the common room, their faces a mix of resignation and nostalgia. Harlan approached the front desk, where a nurse in her 40s greeted him with a polite but weary smile. "Sheriff, what brings you here today?" she asked, her eyes betraying a hint of curiosity. "I'm looking for someone who might remember the Pine Hollow Orphanage and the fire that happened there," Harlan replied, his voice steady despite the urgency he felt. "Someone who might have been a survivor or who knows the people who were involved." The nurse's smile faded slightly as she considered his request. After a moment she nodded. "There is someone," she said quietly, "but I should warn you she's not in the best state of mind. Her name is Edith Whitley. She was one of the last surviving staff members at the orphanage before the fire. She's been here for years and her memory, well, it comes and goes." Sheriff Harlan felt a glimmer of hope. Edith Whitley could be the key to unlocking the mystery of the Silent Night Stalker. He followed the nurse down a dimly lit hallway to a small, private room at the end. The door creaked as it opened, revealing an elderly woman sitting by the window, her thin frame wrapped in a faded shawl. Her hair was a wispy white, and her eyes, though clouded with age, held a sharpness that suggested she hadn't entirely lost touch with reality. "Mrs. Whitley," the nurse said gently, "this is Sheriff Harlan. He'd like to talk to you about the orphanage if you're up for it." Edith turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto the sheriff's with a clarity that surprised him. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke. "The orphanage, yes, I remember." Harlan pulled up a chair beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to tread carefully. Too much pressure and she might retreat into herself, too little and he might miss crucial information. "Mrs. Whitley," he began softly, "can you tell me about the fire? About what happened that night?" Edith's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and sorrow as she recalled the events of that fateful night. "It was Christmas Eve," she said slowly, her voice quivering. "The children were excited, hoping for gifts, even though there wasn't much to give. The fire? It started in the middle of the night. We never knew how. It spread so fast, too fast. We tried to get them out, but so many didn't make it." Her voice broke and she paused to collect herself before continuing. "There was one boy, Daniel. He was always quiet, kept to himself. But that night, I remember, he wasn't there when we counted the children. We thought he might have run off, scared by the fire. But we never found him. Some said he died in the fire, Others whispered that he escaped, but no one knew for sure. Harlan leaned in closer, his mind racing. Did Daniel have any family? Anyone who might have taken him in after the fire? Edith shook her head slowly. He had no one. That's why he was at the orphanage in the first place. But after the fire, strange things started happening. People said they saw him lurking in the woods, watching the town from afar. But no one could ever find him. It was as if he became a ghost, haunting the town. The sheriff felt a chill run down his spine. Could Daniel be the Silent Night Stalker? A boy who had survived the fire, only to grow into a man bent on revenge against those he believed had wronged him? Mrs. Whitley, Harlan asked, his voice urgent, do you remember anything else about Daniel? Anything that could help us find him? Edith's eyes glazed over for a moment, lost in the fog of memory. Then slowly she nodded. He had a scar, she whispered. A burn across his left cheek. He tried to hide it, but I saw it once when he was sleeping. It made him angry, so angry. The sheriff nodded, committing every detail to memory. A scarred man, possibly still living in or near Pine Hollow, driven by a twisted desire for revenge. It was a lead, and right now it was the only one he had. As he rose to leave, Edith's voice stopped him. Sheriff, be careful. Daniel, if it is him, he's not the same boy he was. The fire changed him, twisted him into something dark. Harlan thanked her, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders as he left the nursing home. The fog outside had grown so thick it was almost impenetrable, the world beyond reduced to shadows and vague outlines. As he made his way back to his car, a sense of foreboding crept over him. He was getting closer to the truth, but with each step, the danger grew. The Silent Night Stalker was out there, and now Harlan was certain of one thing. This Christmas would be marked by a final, deadly reckoning. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The fog seemed to thicken with each passing minute as Sheriff Harlan drove through the deserted streets of Pine Hollow. The once quaint town now felt like a ghostly shell of its former self, the festive decorations hanging like grim reminders of the terror that had gripped it. Harlan's mind was racing, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. If Daniel was indeed the Silent Night Stalker, then the entire town was in grave danger. He knew he had to find him before nightfall. The fog, which had begun as a harmless weather pattern, now felt like an oppressive force, obscuring not just the roads but the very truth he was seeking. The air was thick with tension, and Harlan could feel the weight of the town's history pressing down on him. He needed to act fast, but where would he start? As he drove past the town square, a sudden realization struck him. The murders had all taken place in areas connected to the victims' pasts, places they had frequented as children, remnants of a life long gone. If Daniel was revisiting these locations, it stood to reason that his next target might be somewhere equally significant. But where? The answer came to him in a flash: the old orphanage. Though it had burned down nearly 30 years ago, the ruins still stood at the edge of town, a crumbling monument to Pine Hollow's darkest chapter. If Daniel was seeking revenge, it was possible he had returned to the place where it all began. Sheriff Harlan's heart pounded in his chest as he sped toward the outskirts of town. The fog was so dense now that he had to slow down, the road ahead barely visible. As he approached the orphanage, the remnants of the once grand building loomed out of the mist like a specter from the past. The walls, blackened by the fire, were covered in creeping ivy, and the windows, long shattered, stared out like empty eyes. Harlan parked the car a short distance away and approached the building on foot, his hand hovering over the grip of his revolver. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the fog swirled around him like a living entity, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He reached the entrance to the orphanage, the door hanging loosely on its hinges, creaking softly as it moved in the wind. Harlan hesitated for a moment, every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn back. But he pushed the fear aside and stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior of the orphanage was a haunting reflection of its tragic past. Charred furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were adorned with the faint, ghostly outlines of children's drawings, their innocence preserved in soot. The place reeked of abandonment and loss, and as Harlan moved deeper into the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He reached what had once been the main hall, a large room with a grand staircase leading to the upper floors. The steps were crumbling and the banister was missing in places, but Harlan could see fresh footprints in the dust, a sign that someone had been here recently. His pulse quickened as he followed the trail, each step echoing ominously in the empty space. At the top of the stairs, the footprints led to a small room at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar, and Harlan could see a faint light flickering inside. He approached cautiously, his hand tightening around his revolver. As he pushed the door open, his flashlight revealed a figure standing by the window, staring out into the fog-covered night. The man turned slowly, and Harlan's breath caught in his throat. It was Daniel, there was no mistaking it. The years had not been kind to him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and a jagged scar ran down his left cheek, the burn that Edith Whitley had described. But it was his expression that sent a chill through Harlan's blood, an expression of cold, calculated hatred. "Daniel," Harlan began, his voice steady but laced with tension. "It's over. I know what you've been doing and I know why. But this has to stop." Daniel's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Harlan saw a flicker of the scared, angry child Edith had described. But it was quickly replaced by the steely resolve of a man who had been planning this moment for years. "You don't know anything, Sheriff," Daniel replied, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just waltz in here and stop me? After everything this town did to me?" Harlan took a step forward, his gaze locked on Daniel's. "I know you're hurting. I know what happened to you was wrong and you didn't deserve it. But killing these people won't bring you peace. It won't bring back the ones you lost." Daniel laughed bitterly, a sound that echoed off the walls like a death knell. "Peace? There's no peace for me, Sheriff. Not while they still live, while they still breathe the air that was stolen from those children. They were supposed to protect us and they let us die." His voice cracked with the weight of his pain, and for a moment Harlan saw the broken man beneath the monster. But he also knew that Daniel was too far gone, consumed by his need for vengeance. He had crossed a line and there was no coming back. "Daniel," Harlan said quietly, "you don't have to do this. It doesn't have to end this way." But Daniel shook his head, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and despair. "It already has." In a sudden, swift movement, Daniel lunged at Harlan, a knife flashing in his hand. The sheriff reacted instinctively, drawing his revolver and firing a single shot. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and Daniel stumbled back, clutching his chest where the bullet had struck. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked up at Harlan with a mixture of shock and resignation. The knife clattered to the floor and Daniel's body slumped against the wall, the life draining from his eyes. Harlan stood frozen, his gun still raised as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The fog outside seemed to press in on the building as if trying to consume it whole. The Silent Night Stalker was dead, but the cost of stopping him weighed heavily on the sheriff's soul. As the final breath left Daniel's body, the fog began to lift, slowly revealing the world outside. The nightmare that had gripped Pine Hollow was over, but the scars it left behind would take far longer to heal. Harlan holstered his gun, his hands shaking as he turned to leave the orphanage. The town had been saved, but at what price? The darkness that had haunted Pine Hollow for so long was gone, but it had claimed one final victim. Daniel, the boy who had been abandoned and forgotten, only to return as a monster. As he stepped out into the cold night, the first flakes of snow began to fall, covering the ground in a blanket of white. Christmas was over, and the town would soon awaken to a new day. But the memory of the Silent Night Stalker would linger in the hearts of Pine Hollow's residents for years to come.